Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In the last few weeks, we have dealt with various women characters from the Old Testament. This week, we will concentrate on a woman from the New Testament, namely Mary Magdalene. She appears in all four Gospels. As well, she has an undeserved reputation as a promiscuous woman. On this matter, the New Testament is completely silent. In the first Gospel, Matthew, she does not appear until toward the end of the story. It was the occasion of Jesus' execution. We are told that there were on that day many women from Galilee who had followed and ministered to Jesus, who were watching during the crucifixion. That's in verse 55 of chapter 27. The women who were named were Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Mary Magdalene, that is, a woman who resided in Magdala. As well, another woman was there, identified only as the mother of the sons of Zebedee. That's in verse 56 of the same chapter. A few verses later, we learn that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, quote unquote, were sitting right across the site of the tomb in which Jesus had been buried. That's in verse 61 of chapter 27. In the same gospel, subsequent to the Sabbath day, Mary Magdalene and, quote unquote, the other Mary, went back to the sepulchre. That's in verse 1 of chapter 28. At that point, there was an earthquake, and an angel appeared to roll back the stone of the tomb. The angel took a seat on the stone. The angel's appearance was spectacular, as it resembled lightning. Plus, the angel was dressed in white. That's in verse 3 of chapter 28. The guards who witnessed this trembled and became like dead men. That's in verse 4. The women who had witnessed this were, of course, afraid, but also able to listen to the angel. The angel told the woman not to be scared, for the divine messenger knew that they were looking for Jesus. Then the angel invited the women to look at the tomb, which was now empty. After this, they were to go and tell Jesus' disciples that he had risen from the dead and would meet them in Galilee. That's verse 7. The women were to complete this chore quickly. They departed the tomb, simultaneously still afraid, but also overjoyed, and ran to tell the disciples what had happened. Before they reached the disciples, however, Jesus met them. Immediately, the women took hold of Jesus' feet and worshipped him. That's in verse 9 of chapter 28. At this juncture, Jesus told them, as the angel had, not to be afraid. Also, he wanted the women to go to, quote unquote, my brothers, and let them know that he would meet him. He would meet them in Galilee. That's in verse 10. In this gospel, women were the first to make contact with the resurrected Jesus and were also to inform the disciples about the rendezvous in Galilee. One of these women was none other than Mary Magdalene. In Mark's Gospel, Mary Magdalene is also introduced toward the end of the story. She witnessed Jesus' crucifixion along with Mary, the mother of James and Jose, and Salome. When Jesus was in Galilee, Mary Magdalene followed and ministered to Jesus in company with Mary, Salome, and, quote unquote, many other women. All of these women had come to Jerusalem to see the execution. That's in Mark 15, verses 40 to 41. As was the case in Matthew's Gospel, after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb. They wanted to anoint Jesus' body. That's in verse 1 of chapter 16. When they got to the site, they discussed the matter of removing the stone. That's in verse 3. Then they noticed that the stone had already been moved from the mouth of the grave. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side. He was dressed in a white robe. This sight amazed the women. That's in verse 5. The young man told them not to be amazed. He knew they were looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who had been executed. He noted that Jesus had risen and was no longer in the tomb. He even pointed out where the corpse had been laid. The man continued by telling the women to go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is on the way to Galilee. That is where they could expect to find him. Upon hearing this, the women left, trembling and being astonished. However, they were too afraid to tell anyone what they had experienced. That's in verses 6 through 8 of chapter 16. In Mark 16, verse 9, however, Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, which would have been Sunday. He appeared only to Mary Magdalene, a woman from whom he had previously exorcised 7 demons. She right away told those who had been with him, a group otherwise not specified. These people mourned and wept. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that Mary Magdalene had seen him, though, they refused to believe. That is the final time Mary Magdalene is mentioned in this gospel. In Luke's gospel, Mary Magdalene is introduced already in chapter 8. Jesus was going through cities in the general area around Nain, preaching. That's in verse 1. Jesus' disciples were with him, as well as some women who had been healed of certain infirmities and of evil spirits. That's in verse 2. Mary Magdalene was described as a woman who had 7 demons expelled from her. That's in verse 3. A few other women are mentioned in this same context. Then, as with the previous Gospels, Mary Magdalene is reported once again to have been with a number of women from Galilee who were around when Jesus' execution had taken place. At the beginning of the Sabbath, these women saw the tomb where Jesus was and how the body had been laid. Later, they returned with spices and anointments. That's in verses 55 and 56 of chapter 23. When they got to the tomb, they noticed that the stone had been rolled away. But when they entered it, they did not see Jesus' body, which puzzled them. At that point, the women saw 2 men wearing dazzling outfits. Naturally, this sight made them afraid, so they bowed their faces to the ground. That's in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 24. The men wanted to know why they were seeking the living among the dead. They also wanted to know whether the women remembered Jesus saying, while in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise. Upon hearing that, the women recalled what Jesus had said. So they left the tomb, told the 11 disciples, and some others. The narrator specifies that it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who informed the apostles. However, they were not believed because it was thought that this was an idle tale. That's in verses 10 through 12 of chapter 24. Mary Magdalene's largest role comes in the narrative in the fourth gospel. As the soldiers were vying to see which one would get Jesus' tunic because it was a seamless garment, we are told that Jesus' mother and aunt, along with Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, were standing by when this was happening. That's in verse 25 of chapter 19. After this, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb quite early, for it was still dark. That's in verse 1 of chapter 20. She was evidently alone. Right away, she saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. This prompted her to run to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She told them that someone had taken the Lord out of the tomb to some unknown place. These two disciples ran immediately to the tomb site. The other disciple arrived first, looked in to see the linen cloths lying about, and the napkin which had been on Jesus' head lying by itself. But he did not go into the tomb. When Simon Peter got there, he went into the tomb, saw the same thing, and immediately believed. At that point, the narrator tells us that these two disciples did not as yet know that the Scriptures said that Jesus had to rise from the dead. After they witnessed this, they returned to their homes. That's in verses 2 through 10 of chapter 20. However, Mary Magdalene stayed at the tomb. As she wept, she took a look into the tomb. What she saw was different from what the two disciples had seen. She saw two angels who were dressed in white. They were sitting where Jesus' body had been placed. One sat at the place where Jesus' head had been. The other sat at the place where Jesus' feet had been. The angels asked Mary why she was crying. She responded by saying that, quote unquote, "My Lord has been taken away, and I do not know where." Right then she turned and saw Jesus standing right there. However, she did not recognize him. Jesus repeated the angel's question by inquiring why Mary was crying. He added, "Whom do you seek?" Because she thought the person who was questioning her was the gardener, she figured he had taken the body someplace else. She wanted to know where, so that she could take the body away. At that point, Jesus mentioned Mary's name. When she heard her name, her recognition was instant. She replied by saying, "Rabboni," a Hebrew word meaning "my teacher." Jesus told her not to hold on to him, since he had not yet ascended to, quote unquote, my Father. But he did want her to go tell his brothers that he was soon to ascend to, quote, "my Father and your Father, to my God and your God," end of quote. That's in verses 14 through 17 of chapter 20. Mary went right away to the disciples, telling them that, quote, "I have seen the Lord," end of quote. Also, she reported her conversation with Jesus. That's in verse 18. That is the last we hear about Mary Magdalene in the fourth gospel. When one considers Mary Magdalene's reputation in the public sphere, one scratches one's head about how she got this reputation. Her sullied reputation was the result of assumptions on the part of subsequent interpreters. To be sure, in a couple of references, she is identified as someone who had been possessed by demons, 7 of them to be exact. But after Jesus had released her from these demons, everything about her in all 4 Gospels could not be more positive. She was present at the execution and anxious to anoint Jesus' body after his death. In the fourth gospel, she talked with the risen Lord and later reported this to his disciples, thus obeying her Lord. At least in terms of how the New Testament generally treats this woman, she was an extraordinary saint, not a notorious sinner. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is, so I'll have a way to contact you later. And also, if you have a question you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.